Hi everyone, and welcome to the next episode of our attachment series. And today we are going to dig into the avoidant type. We're going to be looking at how the avoidant attachment style looks at the world. We're going to be looking at how the avoidant attachment style shows up in relationships, and we're going to be looking at key triggers so we can understand this attachment style in more detail. So hold on tight, let's do this. So I think the avoidant attachment style does have a bit of a bad rep. You will have seen that style in many different movies, particularly characters who are loners, who are independent, who like to do their own thing. A lot of the characters that we really admire in the movies, people like James Bond, for example, is your classic avoidant. He has difficulty sharing emotions. He has difficulty being intimate. He's difficulty talking about his feelings, and he has lots of relationships, which stops him from ever getting too close or developing, intimate relationships. And we can have avoidant men and avoidant women. And it's a very common attachment style. And if you have been digital dating over the last few years, or you've been online, I'm sure you will have met many of them. I have avoidant attachment styles, or at least I have some avoidant attachment traits. So I'm quite familiar with some of the things we're going to talk about in the video today. So firstly, how does an avoidant attachment style get created? Now, a lot of the time, it comes from when we were children and we didn't necessarily get the love or attention that we needed. Now, there is a spectrum of avoidance, and sometimes we can have a few avoidant traits, or we can have a lot. And a lot of it can be dependent on our childhood, and it can also be dependent on key events that we've experienced throughout our life. So that avoidant attachment style generally develops when we were children and we didn't necessarily get the love or the attention that we wanted. We might have experienced our caregivers and our parents as being rejecting or being emotionally distant. Maybe our parents were unavailable emotionally. Maybe they were emotionally unavailable, or they were physically unavailable. They just weren't there. Maybe they were busy all the time. Maybe they were working a lot. Maybe they had other stress or other issues to deal with, which meant that they weren't there for you at the time that you needed it. You might have had parents who discouraged emotional intimacy or expressing one's emotions. In some families and some family cultures, that's how it was. People are encouraged not to share their emotions, to have, as we say in England, that stiff upper lip, deal with things yourself. It wasn't okay to be vulnerable. It wasn't okay to be emotional. And what the child learns in that situation is, I will learn to deal with this myself. I will be independent. It's that safe space of, I don't need anyone but myself to deal with this. And that is very common for the avoidant attachment type. And also sometimes when our parents just weren't there for us, or when we did experience them as rejecting, then what did we learn in those situations? We learned that it wasn't safe to depend on them. It wasn't safe to depend on them for love and support when we needed it. And what does the child decide? Well, it decides, okay, I'm okay on my own. I don't need them. I can deal with this on my own. And that's how it is, and that's how it develops throughout the person's life. Their happy place, their safe space, ultimately is on their own. That's where they feel comfortable. That's where they feel they can manage their emotions. So this is how it works. And that attachment style will develop throughout your life. We have these early experiences in childhood, but then what happens as we get older, we attract relationships and situations that kind of crystallize and strengthen that view that we are okay on our own. That's our happy place. And that's how the attachment style forms and strengthens our early childhood experience and those key formative events throughout our lives. Maybe your parents were busy, maybe they were moving from job to job. Sometimes these attachment styles can get created when we're moving a lot through our childhood from house to house. Anywhere where there's a real lack of consistency, lack of consistent support, then we can create that kind of avoidant attachment style. Which means, as I mentioned before, it's just not safe to depend on other people. It's not safe to rely on other people emotionally. So how does the avoidant attachment style show up in relationships? Well, the first thing is that there is emotional distance. What does that mean? Some people like to talk about their emotions. Some people like to share how they feel. They like to share their feelings and their worries and their concerns, and ultimately to have a transparent relationship. For the avoidant type, they might like to talk a lot, but on the key things, the emotionally key things, they generally feel uncomfortable or reactive to that intimate communication. So a lot of the time you might find, if you're dating someone with this attachment style, that when you do talk about serious things, you do talk about these emotionally things, or you're vulnerable, that they kind of shut down or move away or feel scared or even disappear, depending how strongly they associate with this attachment style. They generally feel uncomfortable in emotionally intimate situations. So for example, if you have somebody with an anxious attachment style who maybe needs reassurance and is being vulnerable with their partner, to the avoidant type, when that happens, they might not be great at offering the reassurance and support that that anxious person needs. Instead, that can actually trigger their fears. Obviously, talking about intimate, vulnerable topics can actually scare the avoidant and push them away. So this is how the dance between the two types begins. So independence is very important to the avoidant attachment style. And what does that mean? Well, how does independence show up? Independence in your career, independence in how you live, the things that you do. So sometimes people with avoidant attachment style can be scared or fearful around commitment. With commitment, there's a sense that somebody will lose their sense of independence, that they will lose that if they're going to move in with someone or commit to a life with someone. There's a feeling of being trapped or stuck, because if the avoidance happy place is being on their own or being independent, how's that going to happen, or how's that going to show up when they're in a committed relationship long term? So there is always a need for the avoidant to have that independence, and sometimes that can show up by saying, I want to go on holiday on my own, or I want to do things on my own, or I need space, I need time to be on my own. And you can imagine what effect that has on the anxious type. If the anxious type is hypervigilant and ultra sensitive to any cues that might trigger the fact that their partner's not interested in them, and then the avoidant type says, I'd like to have some space, I'd like to have some space to myself, you can see how, again, that's going to trigger the anxiety in the anxious attachment style. So again, we can see how this dance starts to get created. Now, avoidant type can have difficulties with emotional intimacy, but there can also be challenges and struggles around physical intimacy. And that can be anything. Maybe physical intimacy is avoided altogether, or physical intimacy is controlled. So for example, you might have people who have lots of short-term relationships. Maybe they have lots of one-night stands or lots of flings. And in actual fact, the avoidant attachment style, that works out very well, because they get their physical connection while at the same time they get to keep their distance. So that plays very well into that avoidant attachment style. Obviously there's some benefits to that, but the problem for the avoidant is that they never get to have a real committed or sincere or emotionally intimate relationship, and for a long time that can be a good thing for them. That they don't want that, but at some point along the way there may be a desire to want to have a more meaningful, deep experience and to create a life with someone. So it's interesting to see how sometimes the type of relationship we have can support our attachment style. And that physical intimacy can show up in other ways. Sometimes, I'm sure you've heard that story, how maybe some guys and some girls don't like cuddling. Some people like to wake up in the morning and cuddle and snuggle up to their partner. Sometimes some people like to spend the night in each other's arms, while other people like to have their own space, or some people don't want to be too intimate. There's obviously a balance, but again, sometimes the avoidant can be fearful or worried about having too much physical intimacy, and again, that can trigger the anxious type's attachment system, the attachment nervous system, in terms of having them feel more anxious. There can be limited communication from the avoidant style, and again, that can happen on a spectrum. Sometimes there's just totally limited communication where only important things or certain things are spoken about. But sometimes when there is a move to have more commitment, a move to progress into the relationship, then, for example, an avoidant attachment style can avoid the topic. They might not want to talk about it, or they might just not say that much about it. Maybe you want to go on holiday or go and have a nice summer holiday together. The avoidant attachment style, for example, can sometimes change the topic or suggest something else. There's a million ways in which we, and particularly avoidant types, can avoid the conversation, avoid talking about something in particular. And you will probably notice that if you've ever dated one or someone with those traits, you'll begin to notice how the conversation can shape and shift and avoid certain topics. And the avoidant attachment style can generally focus on goals. It's normal if you look at in life in general, a lot of the famous explorers, for example, people that have achieved incredible goals, people that have climbed Mount Everest, people that have achieved sporting success or business success. In order to do those things, you generally have to be very self-motivated, you have to be very independent, you have to be able to push yourself on, and you also generally can't be reliant or dependent on other people. So a lot of the time, business success, career success is common with people that do have that avoidant attachment style. It works for them to be on their own. However, in situations, relationships, whatever, anywhere else where they have to be dependent on other people, that's when their attachment style gets triggered. Now, this avoidant attachment style, like all attachment styles, mostly unconscious. When we're dating our partners or we're in a relationship, it's easy for us to think, oh my goodness, it's so obvious. But a lot of the time, these things are very subtle. We can't always see them. And a lot of us just aren't present to. We don't have that level of self-awareness as to understand how we're behaving the way that we do. And it's important, that's how relationships work, because you're with somebody else and they get to say, hey, look, what's going on here? And you get to see it in somebody else and they get to see it in you. And that's really cool. The problem is a lot of people don't like to be told, or they don't like people to say what's going on for them. And that's what self-awareness is all about. It's about looking at, hey, what can I be responsible for? Now, the avoidant type historically doesn't like to look at their own issues. In order to look at your own issues, that means you've got to be vulnerable, that you have to look at your shortcomings, at your fears. And that's kind of opposite to what the avoidant type wants. The avoidant type wants to avoid the intimacy, the painful emotions, right? So that journey of self-discovery, self-awareness, obviously it slowly happens, but it doesn't come naturally to the avoidant attachment style. But over time, it's no problem. Once you're on the attachment journey, once you're on the self-discovery journey, then you can begin to have some self-awareness in terms of what's going on for you. So people with an avoidant attachment style do have certain triggers in relationship. They do have certain things that trigger them. So for example, they can feel trapped and suffocated if their partner has high emotional needs or is constantly sharing their emotions. To the avoidant type, that is scary. So that's one of the key fears of the avoidant, is that they might feel trapped or suffocated in their relationship. And when that happens, unless they're self-aware, they'll want to go for the door, or they'll want to distance themselves, either emotionally or in communication or physically. The avoidant type, as I said before, can feel trapped and also can feel stuck in terms of commitment. Commitment is scary because if you're committed, there's no emotional freedom or physical freedom. Sometimes the avoidant type feels like their partner is trying to change them, and that can be something else that is scary for them because they're happy in their space. And the thing is, ultimately, the happiest place is when they're on their own, when they don't have to rely on anyone. That's a good place, but that's also a sad place eventually, because for most of the people looking into this, they want to have a healthy relationship going forward and they want to find love. As you can see, this attachment style is a difficult one. All of our attachment styles are challenging, for sure. And a lot of us will have, anxious traits and avoidant traits and secure traits. It's good just to notice which ones they are. And over time, sometimes they can lean more to one side than the other. The important thing is to have self-awareness and to understand what your attachment traits are, what your style is, and begin to do something about it. At least if you know what's going on, then you are close to solving your problems. Okay, so on this series, we're going to dig a little deeper into all of these attachment styles, but I hope today you've kind of got a good idea of what the avoidant attachment style is, how it works, what its triggers are, how it shows up in relationship, and then we're going to be looking at how it shows up in dating. The types of communications you have, the types of conversations you have, the types of emotional dynamics you have in your relationships. So I'm looking forward to sharing all of this with you, and I will see you around. Have a good one.